Today we will be discussing extremist attitudes. Looking at the article for today's reading, The Sociology of the Radical Light, the author begins by discussing how during the past 2 decades we have seen a great deal of success for radical right parties throughout much of Europe, including but not limited to Germany, Italy, Sweden, Switzerland, etc. The author points out a problem in the literature among social scientists who focus on radical parties. There is not really much consensus concerning what we mean by the radical right. There is some consensus about which parties fall under the radical right umbrella, but in terms of a consensus on a conceptualization, as is often the case in political sociology and other sociological sub-areas as well, we do not have a clear-cut consensus on the term. He argues that the objective of the radical right is to build strength, a sense of strength in the nation or civilization by making it more ethnically homogeneous and by returning to traditional values. Individual rights and social rights are considered to be secondary to the goals of the nation, its civilization, and its strength. The radical right often are populists, invoking notions of there being a corrupt elite taking power away from the common people, populists who accuse elites of being self-interested and not wanting to protect the well-being of the morally pure common people. Political radicals they claim that society has to undergo a major transformation of some kind. The type of objective that they put forward for this envisaged major transformation either has a vision of society's future that is radically different from the present moment, or it is a radical change that brings us back to an idealized image of the past. Extremists make demands that diverge from the general will or consensus of the public. They are often putting forth obscure attitudes that are far removed from the general population. Extremists tend to oppose pluralism, the value of pluralism, and stand against any kind of difference or dissent. They are therefore opposed to the free marketplace of ideas. This latter aspect read here on this bullet, of course, applies to both the radical left and right. Extremists tend to oppose democratic systems. They exhibit authoritarian traits, and they reject egalitarian values. Somewhat in connection to our discussion of threat in the previous lectures, it can be said that the radical right like to emphasize sociocultural issues. And they emphasize sociocultural issues as a reaction to this perception that their ethnic group is no longer dominating in their society. There is a threat, a symbolic threat, usually revolving around racial or religious lines. They tend to believe that mixing of ethnicities will result in the cultural extinction, that cultural compatibility is not a possibility, but rather that their culture and their society as they know it will become extinct. They see chances for assimilation to be slight at best, and that the differences between the cultures that are under consideration are too fundamental, too insurmountable to be able to coexist. Whereas traditional types of racists may believe that one race is superior to another, a more common form of radicalism it doesn't really have this sort of hierarchy of racial superiority. What we more often see, I mean, that of course exists still, but what we more often see is the emphasizing of ethnic incompatibility, the claim that these two ethnicities or civilizational identities cannot exist side by side. As I said, the radical right often exhibit populist worldviews in both its vertical and horizontal tensions. If you do not remember what I'm referring to with the vertical and horizontal tensions, the vertical tension of populism demonstrates its core quality, its minimalist definition, its thin-centered definition, where there is a corrupt elite in society that take power away from the common people. That is the vertical tension within the populist framework. The horizontal tension that intersects with this vertical tension refers to the outside groups and forces that the corrupt elite allegedly cooperate with to the detriment of the ordinary citizen. The radical right is not only concerned with political elites, but other cultural elites are also excluded from the category of us in the us versus them narrative that is so characteristic of populist thinking. Established parties, it is said, do not compete fairly within an election, but rather collude with one another to the detriment of the ordinary citizen. We have an example of this from the AFD party, who we have discussed several times. The AFD and the Manifesto Right. Behind the scenes, a small and powerful elite within the political parties is secretly in charge, and it is responsible for the misguided development of past decades. It is this political class of career politicians whose foremost interest is to retain their own power base, status, and material well-being. It is a political cartel which operates the levers of government power insofar as these have not been transferred to the EU. So we have, borderline conspiratorial language being used here. Again, when we discussed, that lecture on conspiracy theories we covered last time, talks about the fact that there are sort of nefarious plots behind the scenes, that what we see before us is not really what's going on, and there might be some truth to that to an extent, but the dramatic narrative here in the sort of let's say discarding of establishment party activity in its genuine form or in its genuine motivational form enters into the realm of conspiratorial ideation. Radical populists are typically anti-establishment. They accuse establishment parties of concealing quote-unquote real issues, issues of cultural extinction, issues pertaining to the lack of social dominance of a particular ethnicity, and the neglect of the native citizens who they believe have a monopoly on the representation of the morally pure common people within the populist framework. There are three commonalities between today's radical right and fascists. The literature suggests that there is the commonality of a desire for racial purity and homogeneity, worries of moral decline within society, often referred to as decadence, because of ethnic changes, as well as the rebirth myth, that meaning regeneration after crisis. We talked a little bit about that on our slides on civilizational populism. The author parts ways with other authors who suggest that the rebirth myth is a similarity between traditional fascism and today's radical right. According to the author, fascists were concerned with images of the future, concerned with the future and society's complete transformation, whereas the radical right today, he says, tends to be more concerned with bringing back an idealized past. So there are a few factors that the author breaks down under the umbrella of demand-side factors. The first referring to anomie or social breakdown. The hypothesis being that radical right support is more likely to take place in socially disintegrated societies. However, some research shows that communities that are integrated, have a strong identity, etc., actually are the ones who are more likely to exhibit radical affinities than our socially disintegrated communities. So this hypothesis has at best received mixed support in the literature. Next, we will discuss the losers of modernization thesis, which refers to individuals who feel as though they cannot adapt with society's advancements. As modern society makes economic advancements and the cultural changes of globalization that come along with it, they cannot keep up with society, so to speak, and they feel that they cannot make a legitimate contribution to that society and thus feel useless. To counteract this feeling of uselessness, They thus must reach for a sense of control over their own lives to restore a sense of pride, and whether that be through economic, symbolic, or individual position. And they look for parties who could rewind the clock of modernity, rewind these advancements, and bring society back into a pre-modernized form. I'm going to read from a relatively long segment on page 248. Hence, those who possess these characteristics can be expected to be among the winners in the post-industrial societies, that being the contrast of the losers of modernization, I should say. However, the losers, those who are unable to cope with the acceleration of economic, social, and cultural modernization, and or are stuck in full or partial unemployment, run the risk of falling into the new underclass and of becoming superfluous and useless for society. This situation may favor the emergence of radical right-wing parties in three ways, according to Betts. First, the losers in post-industrialization processes may be supposed to become anxious, bewildered, insecure, and resentful, sentiments that may be channeled into support for policy proposals that stress the need to return to the traditional values of the status quo. Second, as a response to the established political party's inability to cope with the perverted effects of rampant economic and cultural transformation processes, many have become increasingly discontented and disenchanted, which has opened up a niche for parties ready to exploit popular political discontent to win protest votes. Third, the fragmentation and individualization of post-industrial societies lead to a decline in cleavage politics, i.e., to a decreased salience of the economic cleavage dimension, which may open up a space for parties that address new issues, such as the immigration question. The losers of modernization tend to be unemployed, unskilled workers, who might be threatened by potential unemployment in the future. Research shows that the working class are more likely to vote for populist parties, and then there is variation in the literature concerning the extent to which not having a college education is associated with populist support or radical support, as well as some mixed results concerning employment. I should mention that the losers of modernization is sometimes criticized, and I might join the criticism for being somewhat of an elitist term social scientists have come up with. The social scientist claims that he or she is in a position where they have kept up with modernity's advancements and they are themselves capable and don't need to try to rewind the clock because they are individually capable of keeping up, so to speak, whereas the losers, as they so nicely put, are in a position where they are bound to ineptitude. So there's a bit of an elitism when it comes to people with PhDs, referring to those who are unemployed or have a low income as losers, simply because they probably just don't like the way they vote. There's then the matter of the ethnic competition thesis. This also relates to group threat in connection with populist or radical support. Anti-immigrant attitudes are some of the best predictors of supporting the radical right. Kind of an obvious finding, but it takes up a large portion of the literature because it's an easy finding to produce. Radical right parties do well in countries that have recently had large spikes in migrant arrivals, though, however, I should say that there's some variation about this. We talked about the importance of the outgroup size. However, there's mixed results concerning whether or not group size matters for anti-immigrant sentiment and, in turn, populist/radical support. The author, I think, makes a good argument here, saying that national level data is not quite enough to understand these dynamics, but that county level data might be more telling because one can maybe not have so much contact with immigrants, let's say, in a county that is ethnically homogenous. Thus, the whole logic of the group threat theory unfolds if the person is not exposed to or having a contact with these quote-unquote outgroup members. whereas it is county level data, the more local level data that allows us to better tap into the everyday lives of individuals and who they interact with. There is this sense of alienation and political cynicism or discontent, which creates an audience among potential voters who are receptive to anti-establishment messages. This type of discontent makes fertile ground for radical right success because those who are so cynical about how politics have gone are more likely to engage in an emotional protest vote, voting from the gut. Low political trust in the political system, our major politicians and our major parties, is associated with voting for the radical right. The author then discusses what is referred to as supply-side factors, which pertains instead of focusing on the demand side, which we have been talking about thus far, and that meaning voters' beliefs, preferences, and attitudes. The supply side instead refers to political parties and politicians. The author discusses how a convergence in political space, I'll explain what that means, offers an opportunity for a radical right party because it makes it appear that all of the establishment parties are essentially the same. So if we have traditional parties converging, all having some sort of ideological alignment, it makes it so that you can't really tell the difference between them and they all get lumped into the category of the corrupt elite. This creates political distrust, discontent, and there's also this great amount of attraction to those that exist outside of this convergence. The anti-establishment force seems a bit more sincere, authentic, not within the mainstream clique. The sincerity of populist rhetoric and messaging is particularly important for trying to build a base of protest votes. Some hypothesize that when the establishment parties cooperate with radical parties, this will lower attraction to radical parties and places the establishment party in a more favorable position. So, for one thing, the establishment party, if they're willing to cooperate with the radical party, is able to build a sense of authenticity, focuses on the images that the radical party has wanted them to focus on, shows that they're not so tied to the establishment as has been previously described, and this allows for the establishment parties to sort of win back votes they might have lost with the insurgence of the radical party. This also doesn't do that much great work for the radical party because then it seems as if the radical party is becoming a part of the establishment if they begin cooperating with them. I'm going to turn to page 255 and going into page 256. The author writes, "The first hypothesis claims that when the established parties choose to collaborate with emerging new radical right-wing parties or associated actors, this collaboration lends legitimacy to the emerging parties and lessens their stigma in the eyes of the voters." Later down the page, these issues also tend to become more salient as mainstream parties talk about them. Hence, this hypothesis claims that cooperation between the established parties and new radical right-wing parties results in more attractive and thus successful radical right-wing parties. Then the flip side of that, the second hypothesis, claims that the radical right tends to lose votes when they cooperate too closely with established parties. The reason is that cooperation between mainstream parties and radical right-wing parties may also result in shrinking niches for further electoral mobilization. Under certain conditions, a situation in which mainstream parties occupy the same ideological space as the radical right-wing parties has a preemptive effect, as the mainstream parties are likely to win back some of the voters that otherwise would have voted for the radical right. Cooperation may also make it more difficult for radical right-wing parties to use the anti-establishment strategy, that is, to present themselves as an opposition to the political class, where a radical right-wing party may be seen as the only real opposition. All right. As we have been discussing the radical right so far, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the radical left. It wasn't in the reading today, but radical left-wing ideology tends to be associated with narcissism and moral absolutism. research shows that those who don't have much knowledge about politics tend to gravitate toward the right-wing and left-wing extremes, whereas moderates tend to be more knowledgeable about politics. Both the extreme left and right tend to be more conspiratorial than moderates as well. And then there's also this very common theme where extreme leftists will tend to not be willing to discuss any sort of serious political topics with those that they even slightly disagree with.